The Tennessee Valley Authority was reform, a reform movement by Roosevelt that helped in so many different areas. Like I said, just, providing low cost electricity to the poorest part of the country, job creation. The other thing that it really helped out in the area was flood control. So many of these rivers in the Appalachian region overflow and come in and just knock out whole towns, and it caused devastation on a yearly basis. So to be able to control the amount of water that runs through the river with the use of a dam was highly desirable for these people that were constantly on the move because of floods. So it had a lot of different purposes. It was extremely diverse. And, the downside in the eyes of a lot of people, especially those in the big business sector, the conservatives thinking that this was going to be way too liberal, was the idea of creeping socialism. In what world does the United States, or does any government, provide electricity to its citizens? Well, that world might be a socialistic world, or maybe some might even claim communistic world. So creeping socialism or communism was something that was a concern by a lot of people. Here's the construction of a Douglas Dam in Tennessee. You can see how intricate it is, how labor intensive it is. You're going to need a lot of people to work on these dams. And every one of these red lines represents a Tennessee Valley Authority dam that was built. So you could see all these different dams that were built throughout the years, a lot of them during the Great Depression in the 1930s. These dams, of course, still stand today, but the infrastructure is suffering, and they're built in the 30s. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And oftentimes they go in there and try to fix them and shore them up and do those kind of things. Today, the Tennessee Valley Authority still plays a big role in that. So it says here, the Tennessee Valley Authority was a multi-purpose public corporation concerned with drainage, dams, forestry, flood prevention, river navigation, agriculture, and electrification. Cheap public power became more and more of TVA's reason for being at this time. So this area right here along the Appalachian Mountains is some of the, like I said before, some of the poorest areas in the country, even today in 2021. There's Douglas Dam right there. Showed you the picture of it being constructed. It says the TVA constructed Douglas Dam as part of the massive project to harness the power produced by the Tennessee River system. The United States Congress created the TVA as the authority is known in 1933. Today, the TVA directs operation of more than 50 dams in parts of Alabama, Virginia, Kentucky, Georgia, North Carolina, Mississippi, and Tennessee. Okay, so another reform alphabet soup organization. Well, it was the Social Security Act. The Social Security Act was meant to help initially those people who were elderly, who were retired, for them to get some kind of an income. You have so many people that were homeless that had lost everything. Many of them lost their life savings when banks closed, and it was a really, really tough situation. And because of that came this reform movement that we still have around today. Hopefully it will continue, but it's being threatened because of the baby boom generation that we'll be talking about down the road here. That's such a large block of people that are today in their 60s and 70s, and they're taking out from Social Security more than we who are paying into it. So that it could potentially collapse. But anyways, it created a pension and insurance for old age, blind, physically handicapped, delinquent children, and other dependents by taxing employees and employers. So we get taxed, we pay that in our paycheck. It's a payroll tax. It goes to Social Security, and it goes to the people who are, you can start drawing your Social Security in your early 60s or mid 60s. The longer you wait, the more you could get if you still go on and work until you're like 70 years old. But it's a entitlement, meaning you're entitled to get it no matter what your age is, or excuse me, what your situation is. You're entitled to this as long as you have paid into Social Security throughout your life. If you haven't worked you're that person who gets money under the table or something, well, then you're probably not going to have much in Social Security, and you're not going to get monthly checks or much in the monthly check. Okay, the National Labor Relations Act, NLRA, also known as the Wagner Act, better known as the Wagner Act. This replaced the National Recovery Act that was deemed unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. So like I've said a couple times in this chapter, is that not everything that Roosevelt did worked, but he would oftentimes go back to the drawing board and create something that did work. Classic example is when the NRA was deemed unconstitutional, he worked hard to urge Congress to pass the National Labor Relations Act. And it was passed. It did set up the NLRA or NLRB, National Labor Relations Board, which still exists today. They oversee labor situations. They protect labor unions and guarantee workers the right to unionize, strike, and bargain collectively. It also opened the door for a labor union known as the Congress of Industrial Organization, or CIO, that was were non-skilled workers. So originally you had the AFL that was still around, but it was only skilled workers. The CIO combined with the AFL, so it's known as AFL-CIO, and they created the non-skilled workers, like Ford and U.S. Steel contracted with the CIO, led by John Lewis. Critics of the New Deal. There are those people who don't love the New Deal. Some people think it's not doing enough. People think that it's socialistic or communistic. A radio priest by the name of Charles Coughlin criticized the New Deal publicly. He had a strong voice on the radio. People would buy into what he was saying, and he would always come out and say Roosevelt needs to do more. So people were hearing that. Huey Long, who was the governor of Louisiana, said that the New Deal was not liberal enough. He said every family should receive $5,000, like almost like in today's world, a stimulus check of $5,000, which would have been a whole lot of money back then. In his mind, people would receive this $5,000 and they would spend it, and it would stimulate the economy. But someone like Hoover would have said that's a handout. They're getting $5,000 for doing nothing. He wouldn't like that. Dr. Francis Townsend was an elderly gentleman, a doctor who wanted the government to take care of the elderly more than Social Security. He wanted $200 per month to those people 65 and older, which would have that was a lot of money at that time also, would have put a lot of money in the hands of elderly people who don't oftentimes spend it as much as, say, younger people would. So that didn't go over too well. But on the left, you see here, this is Huey Long, and this is actually Dr. Charles Townsend. And here's Coughlin. Eleanor Roosevelt was the wife of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I told you before, she was the niece of Theodore Roosevelt. She did a lot as first lady, maybe more than any first lady ever in the history. Later on, she goes on to be a big part of the United Nations after the death of FDR. But she was oftentimes referred to as FDR's legs, since he couldn't really do much. He couldn't go too many places because of his handicap. She would often be the one that would hop on a plane and go to different places. FDR was someone who wanted to grant more rights to African Americans, but always felt like if he did that he would lose the support of the South, and a lot of his New Deal legislation wouldn't pass. So he would send his wife, Eleanor, to the South to, give speeches about stopping lynching of African Americans. She championed an anti-lynching bill, something that Roosevelt really felt like he could not do. The election of 1936, one of the biggest landslide victories in history. People felt obviously comfortable with what Roosevelt was doing to try to alleviate the Depression. In 1936, the Depression was still pretty deep. And this goes kind of against what I've said before, that people vote their pocketbook because they didn't have very much money in their pocketbook, but they trust FDR that he was at least doing something. He won 523 electoral votes to Alfred Landon's 8. And he's just, trying. The 20th Amendment passed during this time previous to this, that had cut the lame duck period down to 6 weeks. So he began a second term on January 20th. Remember, it used to be that presidents would have to wait a long time. They'd get elected in November, and then they have to wait all the way until April to be sworn in as president. And during that time, the president who's been voted out is oftentimes referred to as the lame duck president. He doesn't have very much power. He's been voted out. People aren't going to listen to what he says. Sorry, March 4th was what it previously was that. Okay, so Roosevelt was very frustrated with the Supreme Court because initially when he became president in 33, he was elected in 32, took over in 33, he had the green light to pass whatever, and that's why he was able to, in his first 100 days, do more than any president in history. But that green light turned yellow, and then at a certain point turned red as the Supreme Court got very, very skittish. Right? The conservative justices in the Supreme Court said, oh my gosh, what is he doing? He's acting like a dictator. He's trying to control the economy. That's why they deemed the NRA unconstitutional, because it was creating artificial scarcity. They were telling factories not to produce, and they paid them not to produce. Same thing with AAA, where they told farmers to cut 20% of their crop. So he's controlling the amount of product out there, which is, they felt, very dictatorial. So they started striking down a lot of his legislation. So Roosevelt was really frustrated with that. And coming off that huge victory in 1936, where he won a humongous landslide, he kind of began to feel like, I could do whatever I want. So he attempted to pack the court with justices that were sympathetic to his cause. They had to be liberal. He wanted to try to do this. He proposed that the president should be able to appoint justices to the Supreme Court, up to 15 of them. Remember, there's 9 at this point. He wanted up to 15. He wanted to be able to replace he wanted to be able to counteract the vote of anyone 70 years or older. So if someone refused to retire at age 70, he felt that it should be that the president should be able to appoint someone else to the Supreme Court, up to 15 members. What he's trying to do is control the court. He's trying to get people who are very sympathetic to his cause in there, that they could cancel out the vote of the older people, older justices who tended to be more conservative. The older you get, the more conservative you get. So it makes sense that if someone goes into the court at age 50 and is very liberal, by the time they're 70, their views change and they become more conservative. And Roosevelt didn't like that. So he says, I need to be able to up the number of justices up to 15 if those over 70 don't retire. Well, it was met with really anger and resentment by the Supreme Court and by Congress, especially Republican congressmen, who said, you're really acting like a dictator now. Hey, just because you won a landslide in 1936 doesn't mean you have supreme power. Here's a couple political cartoons here. It says here, you've held up things long enough. This is FDR acting like a policeman. You can see the elderly justice in the Supreme Court. He's handing him a ticket. It says what the president is after, his thumb on the Supreme Court justices. This one right here has him whipping the horses. It says the 3 branches, judicial, executive, legislative. And then this one right here says, Mr. President, I gave you a big vote of confidence last November. That's the 1936 election. But I don't give you a mandate to pack the Supreme Court. So he took a lot of heat for this. And in the end, though, here's what ended up getting passed as a face save for the president, because Congress knew that he was a very popular president and they had to at least do something. They give the justices in the Supreme Court, what's called the golden handshake. At age 70, a Supreme Court justice could retire with full pay until they die. So they can just retire at 70 and go do whatever they want and get full pay until they die. That's an enticement to get the heck out. That's an enticement for them not to stay until they're 100, like they could if they wanted to. They don't usually stay till they're 100, but you have people in there that are pretty old. They're in their 80s and sometimes in their 90s. So, but they decide that work is more important than not working, and still, but they have the option at age 70 to resign or retire, and they get full pay, and they don't even have to work. So that was the compromise for the president that they gave the president. Congress did. Okay, so the New Deal score sheet. During Roosevelt's first term, the Depression didn't disappear. Not at all. It's going to take 10 years for this to go away. Employment, though, was down from 25% to 15%. Right, within the first 4 years, he cut it by 10%, which is pretty good. Now, would natural forces have done that anyway? Maybe. But you can't deny the fact that this guy is really digging his heels in and trying to create jobs. In 1937, the economy took another downturn when Roosevelt recession hit. And the reason is because in 1937, they started pulling money out of people's paychecks for Social Security. So people panicked a little bit and they stopped spending, and things were getting better. And then all of a sudden they got a little bit worse, and then they got better after that. Finally, FDR just said, heck, we're just going to embrace the policies of a British economist by the name of John Maynard Keynes. The Keynesian philosophy of economics is just get a huge debt, build up a huge debt and get money in the hands of people so they could spend it, and the government will take care of the debt. It's planned deficit spending. We're really good at it now, as we know what our deficit is in the trillions. Planned deficit spending, because deficit spending puts money in people's hands, not necessarily the government's hands, but in people's hands. So critics were shocked by the try anything attitude of FDR, who had increased the federal debt from 19 million to 40 million. They'd be shocked, people who lived in that time, what our deficit is now. So business people didn't like him, but a lot of people did, as you could see by the 1936 election. He provided bold reform without revolution. This is the closest this country has ever come to blowing up our government, not literally, but figuratively, just starting all over again. Revolution. Reform happened. They saved this country from revolution, most people think. So you could kind of see here the impact of the New Deal. 1929, here's where the unemployment is way down here. So things start to get better. Stock market crashed here, and then unemployment went skyrocketing. Look at this. When FDR comes in here in 1933, he starts, creating jobs. So the unemployment goes down, continues to go down. Things are getting better. And then boom, unemployment goes up again because people stopped spending in 1937 once money was taken out of their checks for Social Security. And then World War II hits, and then boom, that's what gets us out of the Depression officially. Not the New Deal, sure did help, but mobilization for World War I, you're either getting drafted in the military or working in factories. There were jobs everywhere. So unemployment's going to go down to it's going to go down to around zero. And there you go.